So before we jump ahead, because I want to really talk to you about what your current position is, because we don't have anybody that I've interviewed yet with BLM. Can you just give the audience a flavor? You started working sex trafficking type cases. Tell the audience your experience in terms of where sex trafficking occurs or happens and how that comes about in Idaho.
Yeah, that was a huge task. I'll give my old partner the absolute vast majority of the credit for getting that going. It was a project that he was very passionate about because it was just not something that had been worked in Idaho by anyone, fed or local. In fact, trafficking, sex trafficking or labor trafficking as a state crime didn't exist in Idaho until 2018. It wasn't a crime until 2018. So how are you going to have units investigating a serious crime in the state of Idaho when it's not even a crime? So I knew my partner needed help because it was just too much. It was too much for him to take on by himself. So I started going around with him to all kinds of meetings, meeting with any police department that would talk to us. We met with a bunch of non-governmental organizations, NGOs in the area that specialize in helping people who may be victims of any kind of trafficking, and reaching out to them, explaining to them what HSI does nationwide, investigate sex trafficking, because it's a huge thing of what the agency does and has for the last at least 10 years or more. And there are dedicated groups in bigger cities. We had a sex trafficking or human trafficking. We had a human trafficking group at my old office in Dallas. That was amazing. And so we take on this task, and it's like, where do you start? How do you find victims if nobody else is looking for them? We're not experts. My partner didn't work trafficking at his old office. He came from a big city like me, and I had a little bit of exposure from the gang side helping our trafficking group. But I knew it was emotionally draining, and I avoided it. But here we were like, somebody's got to do it. So we start finding girls to interview. That we start from the NGOs. They lead us to different possible girls that are willing to talk to us. And we do a lot of our interviews from the women's prison here in Boise, because a lot of the girls were locked up for pretty low-level drug offenses, possession offenses. So a lot of our interviews are out there. Some of our interviews are at the office of whatever NGO we're working with. But we interviewed, within the first year of trying this, we kind of kept a tally because we were having to generate our own stats. There were no stats. How's there a stat for a crime that nobody's investigated? So I think we interviewed about 60 girls in the first year, and they all had the same story, or almost all. Local girls, usually from rural areas, coming from a, let's say, poverty-stricken family, usually very low income, get to drugs at an early age, 13, 14, 15 years old, and marijuana, ecstasy, meth, MDMA, you name it. And it progressed from there to where eventually they become addicts at the age of 16, 17, 18. They're only hanging around drug dealers. They're only hanging around other dirtbags. And eventually they get to where they can't pay for their dope. Well, their drug dealer then becomes their pimp because, hey, if you want your dope, how are you going to pay for it? Well, here's how you're going to pay for it. And so they all had this similar story of how they would start getting turned out by their drug dealer. And eventually it would escalate from there, where their drug dealer is like, man, this is too much. Like, I'm gonna hand you off to somebody else. And then they get moved to a guy that is a little bit more into prostitution than drugs, and so on and so forth. And it was very consistent from interview to interview. That was a main underlying theme of almost all these girls. And it was very disheartening, because not only are we trying to find victims that we can actually help and build a case on and put their trafficker in federal prison, but we're having to do these interviews where these girls can't remember enough details. They can't remember what their trafficker drove, like even the most basic description. They can't remember where he lived. They can't remember the hotels that they were taken to. They can't remember specifics for us to try to recreate an investigation. And that was horrible, because we would spend hours in multiple interviews trying to get these girls to trust us. They don't want to talk to the cops. Cops are the one that put them in jail for having a little baggie of dope that their trafficker made them hold on to during a traffic stop. So we do all this work only at the end to be like, we don't have enough. We can't start anything. And man, it was very emotionally draining. We did have one really big successful case that we got started on with a local victim connection, and it was super successful. I won't even get into the details because it was finished kind of after I left, but we did get a guy who had been trafficking women out of Seattle, Portland, and here for 15 years and never been caught. But a lot of that emotional toll was a big reason why I avoided working human trafficking when I was in Dallas, because I knew that would happen.
Yeah.
And yeah, it started to weigh on me a lot, and just a lot of other factors of what was going on in my life here with HSI that really just made me think it's time to move on to something else. And it was a lot of the work that I wanted to do, I wasn't allowed to do, or work that I was good at, or it just wasn't supported up here. I felt very lost in like the things that made me love that job more than anything were no longer there.